This week on the Wheelhouse, the Whalers, the Patriots. It's pro sports and politics. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. A couple of months ago, Governor Ned Lamont said, we're ready. Ready for what? The National Hockey League, maybe even the return of the Whalers to Hartford. You see, the Coyotes, that's an NHL team in Arizona, were on the brink of having to find a new home. Guess what? That team is on the move, but they're going to Utah. Well, today we're going to talk about the future of pro sports here in Connecticut on that note, and we got a special guest for you. He works about 10 feet away from me. Connecticut Public's own Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show. Good morning, Colin.
Good morning, Wheelhouse.
Yeah, good to have you back.
Good to be back.
Wheelhouse King, Wheelhouse Host Emerita, whatever you want. What do you want?
We're going way too far here.
Okay. Dan Haar, columnist and senior editor at Hearst Connecticut Media Group. Welcome, Dan.
Fantastic to be here. First time in the new studio.
First time in the new studio. It's going to be a very serious event having the two of you together today. Might have to call the fire department.
You just turned me down for lunch, so.
I'm good for a week after that, though.
I'll get on Dan after the show about having that lunch. All right, guys, we want you to participate in this conversation. Even if you don't like sports the way that the three of us do, I think you'll find out a lot about infrastructure, policy, things like that. And I think you'll want to listen, maybe even call in and ask questions. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Hey, I want to break this down for folks. Dan, I'll ask you, since we got you coming in from out of the building here, all the way from wherever you live. At this point, the legendary Hartford Whalers logo, you can still see that pretty much everywhere. People always
top five seller.
Top five sellers.
27 years later.
And so who was this team, and why did they leave us all the way back in 1997?
The Hartford Whalers came in the early 70s, sponsored by Aetna Insurance Company, as a member of the then existing World Hockey Association. And when the World Hockey Association merged with the NHL, I believe it was in 74. Is that right, Colin?
It seems about right, yeah.
Where were we in the Adams division back in the 70s?
Adams division,
Adams
that's
division,
right,
yeah.
with the Montreal Canadiens and the Boston Bruins, New York Rangers. It merged in, and it happened to merge into the NHL by happenstance because there was money, power, and people here in Hartford. We still have some of that, but I would argue not enough to bring back an NHL team.
But we don't have NHL hockey. Ever since then, though, Colin, ever since we lost them in 97, I guess why did we lose them, and are we still trying to get them back?
Well, first of all, we should say that the Whalers, although it was very exciting when Gordie Howe and his two sons came here to play, and the Whalers were not a storied hockey franchise. In 1986, the city of Hartford gave them a parade for making the second round of the NHL playoffs.
7 games.
Yeah.
7 games.
Right around that time, 4 years later, just to give you a sense of how starved Hartford is, 2 guys wrote a book about the Yukon men's team called, I get the exact title, Yukon's Dream Season, The Road to the Final 8.
In 98?
No, this was in 90.
No, that's right.
So,
Tate George?
So, I mean, we really didn't have a lot. Having an NHL team here was great. But, the owner, Pete Karmanos, decided he was going to move them to Carolina, and no adequate arrangement could be reached up here. A lot of people pointing a lot of fingers at a lot of people. But I just want to say this, and unfortunately, Danny and I are not going to be very far apart on stuff today. But I think maybe it's time to end this charade. I mean, an NHL franchise is probably not coming here anytime soon. The XL Center, where they'd have to play, is the sick man of Europe right now. It's in no shape. I mean, teams tend not to come to a place where where there's no place for them to play. Also, you have to understand, the NHL has never loved the idea of Hartford as a home city. It's not the kind of media market they want. And you have to get 4 NHL franchises, all of whom consider Connecticut to kind of be their backyard to go along with an idea like that. So I feel like when people like Ned, dangle this idea, they're really offering an empty hand to us. It might look pretty good, but I don't think there's anything in it.
And that's kind of where I was getting to. This is kind of where the conversation gets political. I think it was Governor Dan Malloy back in 2018. He's saying, let's try to get $250 million for the XL Center renovation. I think he went a little farther than Lamont has. Lamont getting involved with the Coyotes here. This is kind of a bad thing to bring up. You're talking about ending the charade. Should you not bring it up if you're not going to be able to make it happen? I don't know.
I'll let Danny take this one.
Here's where I think it's a problem. Look, we all know that an NHL team is not coming back to Hartford. There are 5 good reasons. Colin mentioned, I think, 2.5 of them. One of them is that this is Boston Bruins territory. They have the right to veto this, and they would. The other reason is that the other issue is that bringing it up is not just neutral, idle dreaming. It takes our eye off the ball of things that we can do and that we should be doing. Some of it is policy, like housing and infrastructure, and some of it is just fun stuff. Let's bring back an NBA D-League team. That's doable in Hartford. Barely doable, but doable. That's the type of thing we should be looking at.
Yeah, to that point, I just want to say, I mean, he's making a really important point here, which is unusual. But all of the arguments for pro sports franchises funded by the public are basically an argument for secondary returns. You're never going to make any money. I mean, City of Hartford loses money on the Yard Goat Stadium. You're never going to make any money from the deal itself. The understanding is it's going to throw off secondary economic activity. And I think both Dan and I, and we really don't agree about very many things, but I think we both think, maybe just consider throwing the money right at the secondary activity you're trying to generate instead of handing it over to some rich guy or rich family that owns a sports franchise and wants the taxpayers to build a stadium for them.
This stadium that we're talking about, this arena, is 50 years old. It's called the Old Mall. That's because particularly if you get there from the parking garage, as I do many times, you're walking down an escalator from, you're wondering where the Sears is. Inauspicious start. You had the blizzard of 78. That kind of messed with the arena a little bit.
He's mentioning the fact, referencing the fact that the roof collapsed.
Yeah. So
with no one in it, thank God.
So
there had been a game that night.
There had been a game that night. The place had been full. Yeah.
And you guys are talking about, Boston wouldn't want this to happen. The XL Center is never really going to get rebuilt. But even so, even just thinking about the XL Center, the NHL also wants you to be able to sell out at least 15, 18,000 seats.
Well, Aetna bought 5,000 tickets a night. And one of the people I wrote about last year reminded me that it was a combination of a sort of working class, meat and potatoes audience or crowd combined with the Aetna ticket handouts. And those, you could always tell who they were. Those people would come right from work. They'd still be in a suit, and they would sit there with their hands on their seat, right? And they may clap, maybe, if there was a big play. At 9:45, no matter what.
Sort of like the casino crowd.
Yeah, no matter what, at 9:45 p.m., it could be a 3-3 tie in March with a playoff spot on the line against Montreal, and that's a real example. 9:45, that crowd would get up and leave. Why? Because the babysitter stayed until 10. That's the way the culture worked, right? And my old colleague went to a Ranger game. The Ranger games used to pack. The Ranger fans would pack it in like the Yankees fans go to, Tampa Bay and that kind of thing. And he was asked, the woman sitting in front of him was making a lot of noise, and somebody behind him leaned over and asked her to be quieter. Right?
It's Hartford.
So the myth, the idea that, listen, I love Hartford. I've been here for 40-something years. This is a great place to be. This is not a rabid sports town.
But what Dan is saying is 5,000 seats from Aetna. Winnipeg, to just get a team back, they had to sell out 13,000 seats before the team even came back to get it back, to have the hockey return to the, I think they had a refurbished, or it was either a new MTS arena up there. They had to sell out 13,000 seats.
Well, Winnipeg, by the way, is sort of the stepchild of the NHL. It's not clear to me that we're a great sports town. or that Connecticut's a great sports state. We love sports. Most of us have passionate feelings about the Yankees or the Red Sox or whatever. I mean, our only major league franchise in the state of Connecticut is the WNBA franchise that plays at the Mohegan Sun. They sell, I think, they average 6,200, 62.
They're on a little bit of a downswing.
Yeah,
though.
they're in the bottom
better.
half of the WNBA.
They were at 66,
but they were doing much.
63.
Yeah.
They had been doing much better in recent years, but now they're a little.
2023
down.
was a bad year. They're in the bottom half of the WNBA.
But season ticket sales are up this year.
You would think women's basketball in Connecticut ought to click pretty well. This is, we practically invented women's basketball here. But even that doesn't do all that well. So 15,000 a night in Hartford, I'm not really sure that's there.
Now, the then Lieutenant Governor M. Jody Rell was in charge of selling season tickets when Karmanos announced he was leaving, and she succeeded. They did sell 11,000 tickets. I still have. I didn't get season tickets, but I still have my playoff sheet for the 8 playoff or 6 playoff games, whatever it is, from the Whalers. So they were able to sell tickets. The city did rally. The question is, can you rally for 41 games a year and sell that many? And the answer is maybe yes, maybe no.
So it's been, we'd like you to call in 888-720-9677. Not maybe the news that you were hoping for this hour if you wanted to tune in. Our panelists here, even myself in doing a lot of the prep, not very likely that you're going to see the Whalers come back anytime soon, maybe at all.
Can somebody here channel Jeff Jacobs? The hallowed, now retired.
You want to dial him up? Maybe he can call in. It's probably too late now, Dan. But.
Yeah, but it may be too late. But we used to have these debates, and he was a big believer in this, and he thought that why not? Why not? Why can't we dream? Why can't we do this? We did it once. Why can't we do it again? And let's do it. And we have the money. There is the money in Hartford, although the corporate support is diminished. Aetna is no longer based here. UTC is no longer exists, and those were really big companies here. So there's some diminishment of that, but let's say there's money. He would say, we can dream, we can do this, and you're hurting the child in all of us by squashing this dream.
But, I'm not a libertarian, although I'm kind of a libertarian on this point. Is it government's job to nurture the child inside of us and make us happy and buy us a little box of popcorn and a soda so we can sit and watch? I mean, I think government has more important things to do than bring in sports franchises to awaken the child inside of us. And I mean, if a hockey team wants to come here or any kind of sports franchise wants to come here, it ought to be paid for mostly privately. It's not a good deal for the taxpayers.
This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. The two gentlemen sitting to my left here, Colin McEnroe and Dan Haar, they weren't buying it when the Arizona Coyotes were potentially talked about as moving to Hartford. We're going to talk more to them after a short break. And when we return, we'll continue our conversation in pro sports in Connecticut. This time, we'll transition from the rink to the basketball court. Stay with us. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Oh, there it is. You hear Pucky the Whale in the background. 888-720-9677. Maybe the last time. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're talking about sports in Connecticut, joined by Connecticut Public's own Colin McEnroe, the Colin McEnroe Show. And Colin McEnroe is going to be talking about a similar subject that we're talking about today, the Pats in Hartford, actually not coming to Hartford. He's going to talk about that at 1 o'clock today, so stay tuned to Connecticut Public today. And I'm also joined by Dan Haar from the Hearst Connecticut Media Group, just chatting about something that isn't going to happen at this moment or maybe ever. You just heard Brass Bonanza, but you won't be hearing it a lot during hockey games, NHL games in Hartford, the return of the Hartford Whalers. A lot going on here in terms of sports. You got the most renowned women's college basketball program of all time. The UConn men just won another national title. Quinnipiac men's hockey won that 2023 Natty. There's also the Yard Goats. And in about a week, Caitlin Clark's going to be coming here, Dan, as a member of the Indiana Fever. She's going to be making her pro debut in Connecticut at Mohegan Sun, playing the Connecticut Sun. So how about that? The success of the Connecticut Sun. We're talking about how they had a down year in terms of attendance, but we're talking about a team that's played 4 times for a championship. Haven't won one yet, but Connecticut Sun.
They were in the finals a couple of times.
Yeah.
I think we're going to be looking for a sellout in that game, no question. The real bigger, broader question is, can Caitlin Clark be the catalyst that brings the WNBA to the next level, whatever the next level is? Right now, the WNBA is in their TV. Forget attendance for a minute. Attendance average about 6,400 per game per team, right? Which isn't great, which isn't terrible. Attendance is okay. The TV contract is the problem. There's no big significant TV contract. The average team salary in the WNBA is $1.2 million total. Total.
Another way to look at this is, what was Brittany Griner doing in Russia? Well, she was in Russia because the WNBA was paying her about $150,000, $160,000. She's an elite professional athlete making 1/3 of what Steve Inskeep makes, and he can't dunk and works in public radio. I mean, this is not voice, this is a major professional sports league in many ways, but in terms of money, it is not.
We see, though, what happens when you do put the games on in ESPN. We saw the UConn-Iowa game was one of the most watched basketball games, period, in the last few years. Caitlin Clark, so far, it looks like there's a difference. UConn Sun, their season tickets are up there. She doesn't even play for the Sun. Their season tickets are up this year.
You could argue that the women's Final Four March Madness was equal to the men's, or at least approaching equal, and certainly in the rounds where Iowa was playing.
More stars in the women's game than the men's.
That's right. There are some recognizable teams, recognizable stars. You have to have a combination of parity where many teams can win and stars, and that's a difficult balance to strike. You don't want any team to be able to beat any team on any night, but you want there to be more than one team like UConn in the heyday in the 80s, in the 2000s. So that balance is something that they're approaching. But in terms of numbers, just to put this in stark perspective, the total WNBA salary, the total salary of all 12 teams is $14 million. That is the amount of money made this year by Dorian Finney-Smith, a 6'7" swingman for the Brooklyn Nets, right? Dorian Finney-Smith is the 114th highest paid NBA player, and he makes the amount of the entire salary of the WNBA. I'm not doing it to say, let's make fun of it, I'm saying that this is a next step that has to happen.
And that's a big thing that I saw in covering WNBA for so long. We used to even carry the games on CPTV Sports when we had the sports network here. There it is, the reason. I'm glad Colin brought that up, that a lot of people will pay in Russia or Spain or Slovenia, whatever it is. Colin, we got the Sun, we got the Huskies, Blue Bloods, I might add, consistently winning and attracting some of the best men's and women's college basketball stars in the entire country. Do you think the state capitalizes off that in any way?
No, I mean, look, I think we benefit from that. I think it's also important to understand that there's a myth out there that the UConn basketball programs are so incredibly lucrative that they not only pay for themselves, but they pay for the rest of the UConn athletic department. This is completely untrue. UConn sports overall are a very heavily subsidized entity. There's also a TV problem there, too. I think the UConn's conference doesn't really have as good a TV deal. But, I mean, really, even these things, and they're great. I'm not suggesting they're anything but great or good for all of us, but they are expensive. They actually, and I mean, Div 1 football is really expensive, and that's an example of a UConn program that has cost a lot of money and done very poorly. You can't only point at the successes. You've got to sort of say some of this stuff was probably a bad idea to do Div 1 football.
Dan, should we be working harder to support these teams rather than looking at pro sports expansion? I want to even bring up Yale men's basketball private, but a spoiler, they're a decent team. Quinnipiac winning the national championship in hockey.
I saw Yale men's basketball in 2014 beat UConn.
Yeah.
They were on a good year, they'll beat UConn.
I know Colin follows the Ivies. What do you think? Should we be caring more about this local sports?
Absolutely.
And even the amateur sports
rather
than
I mean, I think like the Hartford Athletic is another nice example. There are fun sports things that don't cost a hell of a lot of money, don't overburden the taxpayers, and can be used to raise the level of public pride in this area. But I think it's now time for Danny to tell his social capital yard goat story.
Yes.
Speaking of public pride,
See
greatest,
what I did for you?
Well, this isn't the social capital story, but the Connecticut Pride in 95 to 2000 was the greatest bang for the buck in sports history in Hartford. You could see NBA, D-League, Development League players basically the same as the NBA. I would bring my little 4-year-old daughter. We would sit on the court at the Armory and watch these players who were basically NBA players. You couldn't tell the difference.
You were like Spike Lee, but really at that
It was
time.
right. I was Spike Lee. I was waving the towel. Right.
I can see Dan yelling like a
with my
crazy man.
sunglasses. Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. I think Reggie Miller played in the D League. Anyway, yeah, the choke. So all kidding aside, and that didn't sell out. That was a great buy. And so there is the intrinsic value of sports, and then there is the advertising value of sports, the sort of glitz, and the two don't necessarily mesh. And I think that's one of the problems that Hartford has. We are a big league thinking place because of where we are in the megalopolis, Boston, New York, D.C., but we are not a big league market. And so that's really the disconnect.
And they kind of do that effectively now. I know that the thought is you bring pro sports here and you can have those conversations, but they're doing that right now at UConn games. You'll see the governor with David Benedict, the UConn AD, or you'll see him with Radanka Marich, the president of the school.
And that's not just CNBC. That
so maybe
is
just do it with
social.
these other
That
things, yeah.
is social capital. When you go to a UConn game at the Civic Center, at the there we go. I'm showing my age.
Oh.
At the XL Center, you're not
The old
just
mall.
yeah, that's right. You're not just there to see. There's the governor with Radanka Marich. You're seeing people that you know. If you're a sort of long time resident of the area here, and you're doing things, you're making things happen. And there was a Yard Goats game a year ago in June. The principal of the University Science and Engineering Magnet School met Sean Tammany, was throwing out the first pitch, and he met with Jeff Curry, who's the chairman of the legislature's education committee, who was singing the national anthem with the gay men's choir, and they met. And policy has happened as a result of that. Bus passes are available for students. Not as many as there should be. It's a start. But that conversation started it. Jeff Curry went to the school, talked to the students. That's social capital.
And I think that's a good argument. I mean, the downside is you're talking about $100 million coffee house, or golf course or something. I mean, what you're saying is the taxpayers should pony up $100 million.
Oh, 72.
Well, by the time you add everything together, now even Art Solomon says it's 90 million. The lawsuits, the delays. You could teach a course on the Yard Goat Stadium as a publicly funded stadium that really went wrong. I know people don't think of it that way here, but in terms of what it did to the city, what the city's had to swallow as a result of all the problems with it, it really isn't a great thing. And once again, it's like you want those two guys to get together. I bet you could build something cheaper than a baseball stadium for them to find each other and have a conversation.
The good news about the Yard Goats is they're consistently getting attendance, right? They almost sell out every game. But to Colin's point, we were told that this stadium could cost about $60 million. I heard 54, 56, 60. It ended up costing, according to the Hartford Courant, $71 million. $6 million to defend the lawsuit about the parcels of land around there, and then $10 million to settle it. So now you're talking about $87, $90 million for the stadium.
So what? Here's where Colin and I differ.
Yeah.
Hartford, you have to do what you are. Hartford is a great AA baseball city. And we have a great AA baseball, the best AA baseball stadium. Now, the political razzmatazz that led to it happening, where the council and the mayor who was on his way out and all that stuff that we all covered, that was not necessarily a clean game. But I don't mean to say it was corrupt. I mean, it was messy. But we have the stadium. It fits the city. It works in the city. And so what if it was $90 million instead of $70 million? Does that $20 million change your life?
Well, I mean, yeah. First of all, one thing I want to back up and say, and I think Andy Zibilis, when he comes on, will want to say something about this too. The history of these kinds of deals, and the Yard Goats are a great example, are people in public service who don't know that much about finance going in to negotiate with somebody who does. Now, Art Solomon, the father of the children who own the Yard Goats, and Art Solomon owns a lot of baseball teams himself, it was head of real estate for Frere Lazard. He was CFO for Fannie Mae. He ran real estate, I think, for Berkshire, too. This is a guy who really knows how to make deals. We sent in Pedro Segarra, Sean Wooden. It was a Tom Decker. Was he the other guy who went in there? It was like Gomer Pyle going in to negotiate with Gordon Gekko. Wow, he was real nice, and he gave us coffee, and he said if we build a baseball stadium, he'll put some baseball players in it. I mean, they didn't know how to deal with this guy, and they got screwed. I mean, this thing sits on the books of the city of Hartford, losing $3 million a year because the debt service costs more than the money that Hartford gets.
We got to get to the Patriots conversation, so I only got to ask you guys one question. I want to look more forward, but I think we got a lot of the Hartford conversation done. Shout out to the people calling at 888-720-9677. We had Bob, who said that he was in the Excel Center somehow the night that it collapsed, the night the roof collapsed. That's a great story to have. And Jed was probably really excited when you mentioned Hartford Athletic. I think it might have been Dan that mentioned Hartford Athletic.
I mentioned it. My next door neighbor is one of the owners.
Yeah, so shout out to Jed and Bob who called in.
Calafiore.
There you go. Last question I have. I do want to look forward. What can we see in terms of pro sports expansion in Connecticut? I think we are going to see some, at least in the near future, something maybe similar to Hartford Athletic, probably, where we talk about maybe some kind of major soccer.
Bridgeport is looking at. Is that major soccer? Is that
apparently it would start off at MLS Next Pro, so it's kind of secondary, lower on the pyramid.
I think that's the right size for that market. And you can get a crowd, especially soccer, because it's a pretty big soccer state. Some of us remember when UConn was a national powerhouse in soccer.
With Ray Reid. Yeah.
Right.
What do you think?
I think Danny's right. I mean, I think we have to scale our ambitions appropriately. And so, buy low and hope we can sell high.
United Soccer League's Hartford Athletic we were talking about, and then Andre Swanson's that guy that is working in Bridgeport to try to bring in the MLX Next Pro. City of Bridgeport saying that CT United could come in by 2025. They want to build a waterfront stadium in the Park City, so look out for that.
Who's paying for that?
That's right. We got to head to a quick break. Coming up this month marks 25 years since the New England Patriots allegedly almost relocated to Hartford, Connecticut. Can you imagine what it would look like if they did? Will Connecticut ever get a pro football league of its own? That's a team of their own. That's coming up. You can join the conversation. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. I've been talking to Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show here at Connecticut Public, and Dan Haar from CT Insider, Hearst Connecticut Media Group. We're talking about sports in Connecticut. Earlier, we remembered the Whale. We've recently been reminded that we're a long way from NHL hockey coming back to Connecticut's capital. Last week, it was the 25th anniversary of another sad event, the dissolution of the New England Patriots to Hartford project. It's a sort of sad commemoration. We got another guest joining us for this, someone who remembers this time very well, Andrew Zimbalist, author and professor of economics at Smith College. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you coming in to talk to us about this.
Good to be with you.
888-720-9677 if you have any questions for our panel about the Patriots, if you could believe it or not, the 7-time Super Bowl champion potentially moving to Connecticut. Let's all jump into our time. Actually, there are 6-time Super Bowl champions. Let's all jump into our time machines here and jet back to 1999. I got a clip to kick this conversation off. Go ahead.
The New England Patriots will play their first home game in Hartford in the fall of 2001. My goal and the Patriots' goal is to open the 2002 season here in Hartford.
You're going to have tens of thousands of people, not just for football, but for the concerts and the soccer and all the other events coming from all over New England to Hartford. So it really should be a win for the Connecticut citizens.
Patriots fans can celebrate tonight. There is no deal with the state of Connecticut.
Sources tell me that Robert Kraft first learned last night that the Hartford Stadium probably would not be ready until the year 2003. This afternoon, he decided that was unacceptable and told Connecticut Governor John Rowland that the deal was dead.
The thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. The thrill in Massachusetts tonight, the agony in Connecticut.
That audio comes to you courtesy of CBS Boston, WFSB News Channel 3, and WTNH News Channel 8 here in Connecticut. Andrew, you were actually asked to testify at the Connecticut State Legislature at this time, right? What do you remember about that?
Oh, I remember that there were a lot of people there, and there was a lot of interest, and that Robert Kraft and his sons Jonathan and Dan were testifying, and that I was working with Ralph Nader at the time. The economic analysis that's been done about the economic impact of football stadiums does not suggest that it's a plus for the host community. Of course, football stadiums are used only about 10 games a year for football, and then various and sundry other activities like concerts or maybe a soccer match or whatever. But at the end of the day, you're using it 20, 25 times a year of big time events out of 365 days. And these days, well, back then when you built a stadium, it was maybe $250 million back around 2000. These days, it's well over $1 billion. The most recent stadium built, SoFi in the NFL, cost $5 billion. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the deal that Connecticut had agreed to with Robert Kraft was a very concessionary deal where virtually all of the money was public money, that they were going to be occupying very valuable real estate by the river. And there were just too many problems that cropped up that were delaying ultimately the construction. And there was an environmental remediation problem and moving of a power plant. And finally, the Krafts got fed up and they built the stadium in Foxborough, and they did it primarily with private money.
But before we get to why it didn't work out in Hartford, could you just help us with why it wasn't working out at the time at Foxborough around 98, 99 for the Patriots?
Well, that was an old stadium. It was basically a D2 college stadium. It had benches. It didn't have seats. It didn't have luxury boxes. It didn't have electronic signage opportunities. Basically, it didn't have it, and it didn't have anything it needed to make an NFL owner happy and to generate money.
At the time, Colin McEnroe was working for a station that we usually don't mention on our air. I want to ask you what you remember about that time, but I got taken away for a second when I was listening to Andrew talk about Foxborough, because I remember going to Foxborough as a kid, and like, you don't want to be in New England in April sometimes with how cold it can get. But like, imagine being there in December or January, whatever it was. I went there in April for an MLS game, and I thought I was going to die. It was so cold, and it was windy and all that.
Right. If you listen to my show today, you're going to hear Jeff Benedict, who knows a lot about this, say that ultimately this put Foxborough on the map, getting the Patriots back. He mentions things like they've got a Trader Joe's now, which seems like a lot of money for a Trader Joe's. There isn't even a common agreement about how to spell Foxborough. There's a 240-year running argument about how the name of the place is spelled. That's how on the map they are. But just to refresh people's memories, or maybe people don't even know about this. So what John Rowland's strategy was, there was no really good reason for the Patriots to leave the place that they were known for being in and come here. But John Rowland decided he would give them a good reason. He would just give them everything. He would open the kimono and the cookie jar and everything and make an offer to them that they almost literally couldn't refuse. And Kraft, things were very broken down in Massachusetts for Kraft. He really wasn't getting along with the Speaker of the House, Mr. Finneran, who didn't like him. Nothing was happening. There's this narrative that you'll hear that Kraft played Hartford like a fiddle. No, Kraft came down here because the offer was so good. They were going to build him a brand new stadium, $375, but we know it was going to cost more, $375 million. We were going to guarantee every year $13 million for any seats he didn't sell. He was going to be able to sell the naming rights to a stadium the taxpayers had paid for. If Pepsi or somebody put up a sign in the stadium, he'd get the revenue for that.
He got all the concessions.
Yeah, he got all the concessions. If Bruce Springsteen, or to Andrew's point, if some soccer game happened there or something like that, he would get all this concession revenue. Like, he wouldn't have brought Bruce Springsteen in. Kraft would just get all that stuff. So the deal was really worth close to $1 billion. And then there was another thing, there was a promise in the special act that the roads around there would be improved so that ingress and egress would each take an hour or less. Now, there was no price tag put on that. I have no idea what that would cost.
I don't think you could even do that now.
No.
But the big point I was trying to make, and I'm sorry I didn't get to this, but you wrote a column for the New York Times back then. Even considering the deal, even before that, I kind of think it goes back to what we were talking about in the first segment. Maybe this is something along the way Connecticut shouldn't have been doing anyway, working with the Patriots to get this team over here. It doesn't maybe help Hartford overall in the long run to do that. Is that the point you were trying to make the whole time?
Well, I mean, I think look, in the lens of hindsight, the Patriots weren't that good in 1999. Nobody knew that they were going to turn into this storied franchise. The deal looks a little bit better. But ultimately, I think there are also a lot of questions about the breaking of our government process through these deals. It's obviously a huge transfer of taxpayer money into private hands. Private hands, a very wealthy person already going to get a lot of taxpayer money. But to do that, we had to have a special legislative session. Andrew Fleischman at the time, I think, said there were 7 committees this thing would typically have to go through. It didn't have to go through any of them. There was a provision in the bill that Jesse Stratton eventually fought off that said that any permitting process that took longer than 10 days, any environmental permitting process that took longer than 10 days, it would automatically just grant the permit. And one of the things that Andrew is referencing, so there was a steam plant on the site. Underneath the steam plant were other environmental problems related to coal gasification that had taken there beforehand. And Kraft didn't know about that stuff. And what he eventually realized was that John Rowland didn't always tell him everything. And businessmen don't like that. They don't like not knowing stuff and finding out new stuff every day. It was like Lucy and Ricky Ricardo. It was, Lucy, you didn't tell me there was an environmental problem under the steam plant.
You got some explaining to do.
He got explaining to do. So, I mean, it does bad things to our political process when we're so willing to hand money over because we're so bedazzled by the idea of NFL football.
I can tell you why.
Tell us why.
There is a reason why. Yeah. I think you have to look at the perspective. We had come off the early 90s recession that was so much worse than this recent great recession that we went through for Connecticut. We lost 10% of all jobs in the early 90s. The defense sector was shrinking and the insurance sector was shrinking. We were psychologically beaten. There are, as Professor Zimbalist and I had conversations at the time, direct effects, indirect effects, and psychological effects. This was pure psychology. This was, we can do it. This wasn't, let's make the money work. This was, we can do something big, and Hartford was desperate for that, and that's what was driving this.
Ultimately, I want to ask you, Andrew, what did the Patriots get in Boston, or excuse me, in Foxborough, really in that area, that they weren't getting in 98, 99, that they ended up getting after the Hartford deal fell apart? And what's the benefit of kind of, not necessarily, they weren't looking to shop in Hartford or necessarily, I guess, mess around with Hartford, but they got what they got ultimately at Foxborough.
Well, they got everything they wanted to. The only problem was that they had to put up their own money to do it. That was built privately, and the rail connection that was built from Boston was also subsidized by the Patriots. But they got the real estate rights to develop land around the stadium, Gillette Stadium. Of course, they also got naming rights on Gillette. But they've built a strip mall that circles around the stadium. And those have been very profitable investments for them. So basically, they got control. They funded it privately, but they got control over everything that could generate money in the town of Foxborough, and they've done very, very well as a result.
But I love that Colin brought up the benefit of hindsight. Even spending billions of dollars now on NFL stadiums or whatever, like the NFL is a different deal now than it was in 1997. 98, like they just had 700,000 people come out, and whatever you say about the numbers, they just had 700,000 people come out for the NFL draft in Detroit. So, like, how's this business evolving of the NFL here?
The NFL is the most popular cultural product of America by a long shot right now. If you look at the 100 most watched television programs on any given year, like 96 of them or 95 of them are NFL games. That's how popular the NFL is. But I think there are questions that sit underneath that, and they have to do with what is the job of government, and is the job of government in any way to build sports stadiums and then hand the money over to very rich people.
Go ahead, Andrew. You were going to chime in.
Yeah, well, no, one of the things that's important to keep in mind here, in my view, is that even though I think it can be very convincingly demonstrated that building a football stadium doesn't pay off for a community, there are psychological, emotional, community-wide benefits. The town gets excited about football. It brings people together. developing community is a value. And so even though it might be heinous ethically to subsidize a billionaire, it does make sense to put out some public money so that the public can enjoy the benefits of having a professional football team in the community. So the fact that a city might lose money, that's not big news. But the question is, how much money is it willing to invest in order to have the benefits of having the football team?
When this conversation was happening, I was 10 years old. So when I had a little bit of breaking the fourth wall, we talked to Colin's team about doing a show like this, because Colin is really versed in the subject. He's going to have a great conversation with Jeff Benedict later today. But I didn't really know anything about this.
You were working for the Bristol Press at the time, right?
Very close. I was a kid appearing regularly as a fan of baseball in the Register Citizen in Torrington. But Colin, the one thing that I think about, like, in not knowing that much from that time, is that, like, thinking about it today, I just can't see a pro sports football team being in Hartford proper because of the way that 84 and 91 currently are. We've always known that John Larson's always wanted to kind of rehab that area, the highway, make a new structure, new infrastructure, the viaduct, all of that. Could this have ever really worked? You talked earlier about the egress and ingress, making it an hour. Like, I think about this now as an adult. It's like, huh?
Well,
did you really do that?
It is Sunday. I'll jump on the other side. It's Sunday, so the traffic isn't anywhere near as bad as it is on weekdays. Most NFL games are on Sundays. So, it isn't that so much. It's more the money, and that was an unspecified cost in the deal. I mean, who knew how much
people
that was
sit
going
in
to
traffic
cost?
for 4 or 5 hours at Foxborough, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, look, everybody knows. Go ahead, Andrew. Yeah.
Well, keep in mind that Green Bay, Wisconsin, with 100,000 people and no major corporations, very successfully hosts an NFL team. And the reason why that's able to happen in the NFL and not the other leagues, such as the NHL or even the NBA, is because they've got over $300 million per team in national television and streaming revenue, over $300 million to every team. And because they only play one game every 2 weeks during the season, it's not like the NBA or the NHL where they're playing 3 or 4 games potentially, or 2 or 3 games during the week. It's not as hard to fill up a stadium on a Sunday afternoon once every 2 weeks as it is to fill it up every day during the week in the other sports. So you can have relatively small towns. You can have a town like Hartford totally able to have a profitable football team there. The issue is whether or not you want to lose the money on the stadium deal in order to bring the team.
I have to recuse myself because I'm a part owner of the Green Bay Packers. I own one share. I do. I own one share of stock.
But Andrew, Green Bay is essentially the Milwaukee Packers, and Hartford would be in the footprint of both, especially the Patriots, but also the Jets and the Giants. So it's isn't it a little different for that reason?
Well, Milwaukee's not very big. Number one. Number two, I never drove from Milwaukee to Green Bay, but it's not a short drive. It's not under an hour. It's well over an hour as far as I know. So yes, they benefit from being relatively close to Milwaukee, relatively close to Madison, but Madison and Milwaukee are not suburbs of Green Bay. Green Bay is pretty far up north.
So thinking about all this revenue that they could have made if they were around and they were playing in Hartford, the Patriots, maybe this market would have been benefiting from that. Did we kind of miss the boat on this at the end of the day? I'm wondering, I think I've had this conversation with Colin. I might have heard it in a podcast that would we be talking about this differently had they decided to build in East Hartford at Rentschler Field site rather than at Adrian's Landing in Hartford?
That's one of the theories, that if they built in East Hartford, they'd be here right now. Because the biggest problems were with the steam plant, the environmental problems. Those were the things that were slowing it down. And when it slowed down, that gave Kraft, first of all, a sense of palpitations. But beyond that, it also gave the NFL and the leadership in Massachusetts time to organize themselves and to make a counteroffer and try to woo Kraft back. The delay the delay of dealing with all that environmental stuff. Also, CTG and and Arthur C. Marquardt, they didn't necessarily want to move, and they weren't going to move for peanuts. I mean, you're going to have to compensate them somehow. So it slowed everything down, and it gave the other side a chance to get organized.
There was nothing there.
East Hartford would have been a much better site, and you're not giving up prime real estate when you build around Rensselaer Field, as the plan was to give up prime real estate downtown to Kraft.
What were you going to say, Danny?
And Rensselaer Field was being marketed at the time as the largest developable parcel between New York and Boston. So that it was viable, but I think the psychology of why that didn't happen gives us an insight into the psychology of why this whole thing wouldn't have worked. It's because we had the wrong idea about what this team was going to be. We had the idea that it was going to be a revival of the city of Hartford. Remember the 6 pillars. That's not what it was ever going to be in any case. So this was a misalignment of goals.
As Colin recused himself earlier, he mentioned that he's a part owner of the Green Bay Packers. Even fans that were diehards of the New England Patriots when they had only been to one Super Bowl back then, these are people that are on season ticket lists for a long time. We know how long you have to be on a season ticket list to be a Green Bay Packer fan. Like, I think I'm having trouble understanding whether football would have actually worked in Hartford. I think now that we know the NFL's this juggernaut, it could probably work anywhere, but there's something different about the Green Bay market because of how football is there. It's Titletown. Something different about the Patriots market because you had a long time where people were actually going to Foxborough to support the team. So I don't know if you have that same kind of equity. I think we were kind of having this conversation in the first segment. Does sports have that same kind of equity? Would football have had that same kind of equity in Hartford?
This would have been good. How good? And what are you willing to do to get to however good it is? How much are you willing to bend your processes? Roland had loaded up the DEP with fixers and hacks, and so he could get environmental stuff through. I think he was a little bit more worried about the EPA that he didn't have any control over. How much of your actual polity are you willing to subvert? The phrase bread and circuses comes from Juvenal, and circuses in that context meant circus games, sports basically, and he used that in 100 AD as an example of how the Roman people had become unserious people. All they cared about was their free wheat and their games, and that could be us right now.
Thank you to all the callers who have called in today, 888-720-9677, trying to participate in the conversation. Markel from New London sent in a comment, said, these public-sponsored arenas are usually a disaster for local taxpayers. And you guys were talking a little bit earlier about lowering the tax burden on people. That's when you probably are going to have a little more success with sports, when you have these sports that are cheaper to put on. You're not necessarily playing for Division I football, something like that. That might help. So thank you for that comment, Markel. We've only got about a minute and a half left in the program, so I'm going to give each of our guests 30 seconds here at the end to kind of go through this. Could we ever have football in Hartford in the future? And if it's a no, even if it's a no right away, maybe we talk about whether or not this could have worked with the Patriots. Go ahead, Colin. You go first.
No, Danny, you go first because I already burned my Greco-Roman reference. I have to think of something else.
I may go to Middle English. I don't know. The common theme here is that this is the city of Hartford trying to do things that really should be done by the state and the region. And the friction between what is good for the city of Hartford and what is good for the region underlies a lot of the dumb thinking that goes into some of this stuff. And by dumb thinking, I don't mean necessarily a bad idea overall for the state.
Anything you do takes money away from something else. So think about how much money you're willing to take away from other legitimately government-funded programs in order to get this result, and think about whether it's worth it.
Andrew, any quick thoughts here on infrastructure? Anything
well, look,
that we can talk about?
First of all, from what was said earlier, I don't think that the Bruins would veto a team moving to Hartford. If Gary Bettman wants it to happen, and Gary Bettman would want it to happen if you build him a $1 billion arena and he had an investor who was willing to buy an expansion club for $1 billion. I don't think the problem there is the Bruins.
10 seconds.
But beyond that, I think Connecticut should be really happy. You've got New York and Boston teams to root for. That's more choice than most people have. You've got professional teams that are playing at the University of Connecticut.
Thank you so much for that. That's it for today. Stay tuned to the Colin McEnroe show later as they'll talk about the Patriots. Show today produced by Chloe Wynn. Thank you so much to Katie Tolarski, Cat Pastor, Dylan Reyes, Tess Terrible, and happy birthday to my mom, Rosemary Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse.